Hey there, Professor Clorman here. Since you've been seeing me in all these different animal costumes from week to week, I thought it was time in our final video for me to show you what I actually look like. So, for today we're going to be taking up the 6/4 chord, different ways composers in the Baroque through Romantic periods use 6/4 chords, and we'll also touch a little bit on the rule of the octave. Let's begin. So we'll be talking about four types of ways composers use 6/4 chords, or four 6/4 chord paradigms. Let's do a quick review of the way we classify them, and then we'll listen to some examples. So when we think about these four types, we want to pay attention to what's going on in the bass, what kind of motion in the bass, the meter, are we on a strong beat or a weak beat, and then a few other details. So let's begin with the cadential 6/4. So this one we already are familiar with. A cadential 6/4 involves a bass that is stationary, staying still, on scale degree 5. Or we've often seen an octave drop from scale degree 5 to an octave lower scale degree 5. That's essentially the same thing. Over that scale degree 5, we have some sort of strong beat embellishment, like an appoggiatura, or in this case, a pair of accented passing tones. So the A and the C sharp are accented passing tones that move down a step. That's how we have the 6/4 to 5/3. And since the 6th and the 4th above the bass in the cadential 6/4 are a strong beat dissonance, that means the cadential 6/4s tend to fall on strong metrical positions. Or to be more specific, the 6/4 is generally on a stronger position than the 5/3 that follows. Of course, since they're cadential 6/4s, we tend to find them at cadences as an embellishment of the cadential dominant. So that could be at a half cadence, authentic cadence, or even a deceptive cadence. That's the part of the phrase where these tend to occur. A pedal 6/4 also involves a bass that is stationary, a bass that is a pedal. So in the first two bars of this example, we can see that there's a tonic pedal. Tonic is the main harmony for those two measures. Above that pedal, we have a pair of neighboring tones that go 5/3 up to 6/4 neighbors, back down to 5/3. Since neighbors are a weak beat embellishment, pedal 6/4s made out of neighbors tend to fall on weak beats. So in this passage, the first two bars are an embellishment of tonic, and the second two bars are basically the same thing as an embellishment of dominant. In fact, since these are an embellishment of a single main harmony, many music theorists, myself included, prefer to label them this way. This is a slightly different analytical notation that emphasizes that there's one main harmony. What this means to show is that there's a 1 chord with a 5/6/5 neighbor tone and a 3/4/3 neighbor tone. I'm referring to intervals above the bass. To be very clear, this doesn't mean a 1/5/3 chord and then a 1/6/4 chord. It's just showing the neighboring motion 5/3, 6/4, 5/3 over a single harmony, either 1 or 5 in this example. Our third category is passing 6/4, so named because it arises over a passing tone in the bass. We'll focus on examples involving passing from 1 up to 1/6 or 1/6 down to 1. In other words, we're looking at a bass of either 1, 2, 3 or 3, 2, 1, where the scale degree 2 in the bass is a passing tone that supports a passing 6/4. In the first part of the example, we're moving from 1/6 through a passing 6/4 down to 1. Since passing tones tend to fall on weak positions, passing 6/4s also tend to fall on weak positions, that is, a weaker position than the chords that surround it. And once again, it's an embellishing chord. We can see that because of the voice exchange, which suggests that tonic is the main harmony for those two measures, and the passing 6/4 serves to help expand that tonic. In the second half of the example, we have a passing situation moving from 1 up to 1/6. The chord in between isn't exactly a passing 6/4. Here's the reason why. If you take a 5/6/4 chord and you add a seventh to it, it becomes a 5/4/3 chord. This is quite common. In fact, it's even a little more common than passing 6/4. Many composers tend to add sevenths when they're doing this passing progression. Our final category, arpeggiated 6/4, is quite different. Let's listen to the two examples and then we'll discuss. In the first two measures, the main harmony is root position 1, moving to root position 1 an octave lower. In between, we have an arpeggio that connects the high A and the low A in the bass. In my own analyses, I would just show a 1 with a line and leave out all the inversions that arise as a result of the arpeggiation in the bass, since the main thing here is root position 1. But if we zoom in for a second on the E in the bass, we have for a split second a 6/4 chord, and this is a 1/6/4 chord. That is to say, unlike all the other types of 6/4s we've studied, where the 6/4s are embellishments of some other main harmony, this is the only kind of 6/4 that actually is the main harmony. When that E is in the bass, we're hearing an A major chord, a tonic chord. The main harmony is 1. So let's try these ideas out with some real music. We'll listen to the first few bars from this aria from Mozart's Don Giovanni, and we're listening for some of the 6/4 paradigms that we just discussed. I've labeled the harmonies, but let's discuss how they work together to build this phrase. The first three chords involve a motion in the bass from 1 up to 1/6, moving through a passing chord. That's a passing 4/3 chord. Basically the same thing as a passing 6/4, except here we have a chordal seventh. And as I've mentioned, it's actually more common in the 4/3 version with the chordal seventh than to have just a triad. So this is pretty typical. So that passing motion from 1 to 1/6 we can think of as a tonic expansion, with tonic as the main harmony. If we continue in bar 3, we have 5/6/5 going to 1. Focusing on the bass, perhaps we could think of that motion from D to A to B flat as an incomplete neighbor. So a tonic expansion that lasts 3 measures, moving in the final measure to 5 for our dominant at a half cadence. And that dominant is decorated by our old friend, the cadential 6/4. We'll listen once again, but I'd like to mention one other detail about the progression with the passing 5/4/3 chord. Often when you have this chord progression where the bass moves 1, 2, 3, some other upper voice is going to follow that bass in parallel tenths. Here's what I mean by that. The bass B flat corresponds to the melody D. The bass C corresponds to the melody E flat, again 10th higher. And the bass D corresponds to the melody F on the last syllable of misera. So those are parallel tenths between the bass and the voice. We'll stay in the world of opera, but now let's travel to Venice for this passage from Baldassare Galuppi. Again, we're looking for 6/4 chords. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a recording of this piece, so you'll be hearing a MIDI realization. One of the first things I noticed listening to the passage is that the bass seems to be emphasizing the note E flat for the first 3 measures. Mi, sol, mi, sol, mi, la, mi, la, mi, sol. Perhaps we could imagine then that that E flat in the bass is some kind of pedal. Does that help us out with the analysis? Well, this is our first sketch at an analysis. We have tonic prolonged over a pedal for the first 3 bars. Then we move to subdominant 4, passing down to 2/7. So that 1/6 chord I hear as a passing chord within the subdominant region. Then 5/7, 1 for our IAC. But let's focus now on that pedal in the first 3 bars. Can you identify the 6/4 chord paradigm? Well, I've sort of given it away, haven't I? We have here a pedal 6/4. So the main point here is if we imagine the E flat pedal for the first 3 bars. Above that, we have G, B flat in the accompaniment, moves up to a pair of neighboring tones, A flat, C, and then in the 3rd bar moves back down, G, B flat. That neighboring motion is the 5/3, 6/4, 5/3 that creates our pedal 6/4 over the E flat pedal. From the world of Italian opera, let's turn now to a piano miniature by the Brazilian composer Leopolda Miguéz. Just to tell you a little bit about this passage, there's one chord I've labeled that we should skip, and then after that chord, we're going to analyze the last 4 measures in C major. In this course, we're not going to take up the question of how you move from one key to another key. I'm just going to ask you to analyze most of this excerpt in the key of F major, and then the last 4 bars in C major. You'll notice those last 4 bars have B naturals and no B flats. So that's a clue that we're not in F major anymore. Let's have a listen. The first thing I notice is that this passage seems to divide into 2 phrases, an antecedent phrase ending on a weak cadence, and a consequent phrase ending on a stronger cadence. And one thing to think about, since the antecedent and consequent begin in the same way, then we can save a little time in our analysis. Things that are true of the first 2 measures of the antecedent will also be true of the consequent. So, what's going on in the first 2 measures of the antecedent? Looks like we start off with our new friend, the pedal 6/4. You can see in the alto and tenor voices the neighboring motion AC, B flat D, AC. And so that's an expansion of the tonic harmony. Let's get a little bit further in the analysis. The annotations I've shown here interpret the opening as a long tonic expansion. You might have wondered, though, in bars 3 and 4, when we have a 4 chord going to a 5/7 chord, perhaps that's an arrival on a half cadence. It's a possible hearing, but I'm going to suggest it might turn out to be fruitful to wait until a little bit later to hear our first cadence. So in my analysis, at least for now, I've subsumed that whole opening within a tonic expansion. And I show a change of harmonic function when we arrive at the 4 chord in bar 6. So what's going on then in bars 7 and 8? I've labeled a few notes that we can skip, those are embellishing notes, but how about the notes that remain? I note that on the 4 chord we have B flat in the bass, which moves up to C in the bass. That's going from scale degree 4 in the bass to scale degree 5 in the bass. What does that tell us about bars 7 and 8? Well, that's a cadential 6/4 chord if I ever heard one. We're at a cadence. The bass has moved from B flat, scale degree 4, to C, scale degree 5. That's a clue that we're arriving on the dominant. The bass is holding scale degree 5 for 2 measures. And above that scale degree 5, the note C in the bass, we have in the right hand, on the downbeat of bar 7, F and A. That's a 6/4 above the bass. And the next bar, E and G. That's a 5/3 above the bass. So we have something like the 6/4 to 5/3 motion that is characteristic of cadential 6/4s. One other thing we have going on here, if we focus on the tenor, is that the tenor introduces a seventh into the dominant 7th chord, the note B flat. So instead of 6/4 to 5/3, we actually have 6/4 to 7. That's actually fairly common. You might be wondering, can we really have a half cadence on a 7th chord? And that's a good question, because we learned that in the Baroque and classical and early 19th century periods, typically half cadences are triads. But later in the 19th century and beyond, a half cadence on a 5/7 chord is perfectly typical, as in this example. One last thing to mention. We learned that cadential 6/4 tends to fall on a stronger beat than the root position dominant it resolves to. Here you might wonder, well, the cadential 6/4 is on a downbeat and the 5/7 is also on a downbeat. And that's true. But if we were counting measures, like measure 1 is strong, measure 2 is weak, measure 3 is strong, measure 4 is weak, then when we get to 7 and 8, you might hear the downbeat of bar 7 as stronger than the downbeat of bar 8. So that's something to think about when we listen to the passage again. Okay, now let's wrap up with the consequent phrase. As I mentioned before, since the consequent opens the same as the antecedent, we can simply copy the analysis of the corresponding measures. So let's wrap up our analysis by analyzing the last 4 measures. And as I mentioned before, we'll think of those in C major, since there's all those B naturals and no B flats. Well, we start off with a tonic prolongation in the new tonic key, 1, 5, 6, 5, 1. That's a neighboring motion in the bass. And how about the last 2 bars? How do we wrap up this antecedent consequent pair and lead to a strong cadence? So we end with cadential 6/4 to 5/3, going to 1 for a PAC. It's a PAC in the key of C major, so this passage on the screen starts in one key and ends with a PAC in another key. That's a technique called modulation that you'll study next term. Here we have another antecedent and consequent pair. This is from a minuet by Ignatius Sancho. Sancho just wrote the minuet for melody and bass, but in the recording I'll play, I've fleshed out the harmony a little bit with some harmonies implied by these 2 voices. You'll be hearing a MIDI recording since there isn't a commercially available recording. Let me share with you my first attempt at an analysis of the first system. The analysis is okay, but are there some ways it could be improved? Well, the first thing I notice is that the figured bass in the first few bars looks awfully busy. 1, 1, 6, 1, 6, 4, 1, 6, 1, 5, 3, 1, 6, 4, etc. It's not exactly wrong, but it's more detailed than is useful. Why is that? Because starting on the downbeat of the first bar, we have root position 1, and by the end of the 4th bar, we're still on root position 1. And what's in between is simply a bass arpeggio. In other words, we don't need to label all of those inversions, since the main bass note for the first 4 bars is E flat. To put it another way, all of the 6/4 chords there are arpeggiating 6/4 chords. So they don't really need to be labeled. Well, that's already much easier to read, and we can see that the shape of this phrase is to start with an emphasis on tonic, and it ends on dominant with a half cadence. As I mentioned before, when we analyze an antecedent and consequent pair, we can simply borrow the analysis from the antecedent and reuse it in the consequent for the corresponding measures. So here's the analysis for most of the consequent phrase. We'll still have to analyze the end of it. One thing I wanted to mention that we've seen quite a bit when we have antecedent-consequent pairs is that the consequent accelerates the harmonic rhythm. For example, in the antecedent we have a whole bar of 4 and a whole bar of 1/6. But in the consequent we move from 4 to 1/6 in a single measure. And the reason is the consequent has to get a little bit further harmonically. In other words, the antecedent often stops on 5 for a half cadence. The consequent often goes 5/1 for an authentic cadence. So one way composers fit that into the same number of measures is to accelerate the harmonic rhythm. We've seen that several times already in this course. So, what about the harmonies at the very end of the consequent phrase? Here's the completed analysis showing the cadential 6/4 progression that arrives at the cadence, the PAC, at the consequent phrase. Back to Venice for a keyboard sonata by Anna Bond. The sonata as a whole is in B minor, but the passage you'll hear is performed in B major. Can you spot some 6/4 chords, and let's see if we can identify which paradigms they involve. Well, the first few bars of the piece sound to me like some sort of tonic expansion. We'll come back to that in a moment. Toward the end of the first system, we're on a 2/6 chord that moves in bar 6 to a 5 chord, so that could have been subdominant moving to dominant. But since that 5 chord doesn't progress to a cadence, we go 5 to 5/6/5 to 1, I prefer to hear that as part of some deeper or ongoing tonic expansion. Then in bar 7, we arrive on a subdominant, and it seems like we're heading toward a cadence, so we'll have to analyze that in a moment. But what about the tonic expansion in the first few bars? We have a bass of B for 3 measures. What does that tell us about the progression? And in particular, what's with the chord we're hearing in the second measure? The main harmonic motion in the first 3 measures is a 5/3/6/4/5/3. That's D sharp F sharp, moves up to E G sharp, moves back down to D sharp F sharp. Notice in bar 3 the D sharp F sharp are delayed 1 beat by a restruck suspension. Also notice in measure 1 we have a pair of neighboring tones that does in miniature the 5/3/6/4/5/3, all within the first bar. So, in short, we have a pedal 6/4 chord in bar 2. Then we continue our tonic expansion. We get to what looks like predominant going to tonic, but somehow we end up back on tonic, and we arrive at the real predominant in measure 7, heading toward a cadence. So let's analyze that cadence. This might be hard to see on the screen, but we can try and hear it when we listen to the passage once more. I hear a cadential 6/4 on beats 2 and 3 of bar 7. And the reason is, if you think about those, look like grace notes, but historically would have been played as appoggiaturas, re, do, si, la, we could take the notes D sharp and B, that would be our 6/4, and they move down to C sharp and A sharp, that would be our 5/3. That's the 6/4 to 5/3, the cadential 6/4 that leads to the 1 chord for the PAC. The music that follows is a little codetta, like a mini coda to this theme. I'm going to skip that for the purpose of the analysis. A few weeks ago, we analyzed a passage from Mazurka, which is a type of a Polish dance. That one was composed by Chopin, and this one here is by Josephine. The right hand is a little complex. There's quite a lot going on in it. So let's see if we can focus on the left hand, the bass line and the harmony as a clue to what's going on in this passage. That will tell you most of what you need to know. But one key to think about: which notes in the left hand count as part of the bass line? The trick here is to distinguish the pa. The are bass notes. The pa don't quite count. Those are really inner voices. Therefore, even though you might be tempted to analyze like this, that D isn't a true bass note. The true bass note is G. We have G for the on the downbeat of 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, most of the passage has a bass note of G. The pa, think of those as inner voices. This is an arpeggiating 6/4, or sometimes it's called a waltz 6/4, or maybe even here we call it a mazurka 6/4. The point is that we can actually leave it out in our analysis and focus on the G as the main bass note. Imagine that the G's on the downbeats ring like it's a pedal, as if it were a sustained bass note. And that leads us to an analysis more like this. So what we have here is quite a long tonic pedal expressed by the G's on the downbeats of almost every measure. The are almost all G's. Above that, we show the surface changes of harmony. Now, once again, there's a lot going on in the right hand, but to tell the harmony, we can mostly focus on the left hand in this example. So the surface harmonies above the tonic pedal alternate between 1 and 5/7. Until finally, in the second system, at the forte, we arrive at the climax of the passage. Notice the right hand is about as high as it gets. We're on a forte, and we have here the dominant going to the tonic to make a PAC. But take a look at that dominant. It's got Ds, F sharps, As, Cs, and E flats. This is a dominant ninth chord, something we looked at a little bit last week and that we mentioned becomes increasingly common in the 19th century as a way to especially give extra intensity to the dominant. That's what we have here, a very intense dominant ninth resolving to tonic for our PAC. I'd like to devote the remaining time on this video to one other subject. We've been learning about the rule of the octave, which was popularized in a publication by François Campion, dating from 1716. Campion was a professor of accompaniment, which really meant figured bass realization. He played plucked instruments like the lute and the theorbo, and his claim to fame is la règle de l'octave, the rule of the octave. What I've shown here, it's a little small to read, but what I've shown here is the first 2 pages of his treatise, and this is what he's really famous for. Even though it's small, I think you can see on the left it says minor keys, on the right major keys, and what he shows is a scale up and down in many different minor keys and many different major keys. But he shows, and this is tiny, but he shows that you can use the same figured bass to harmonize every scale, that there's a standard way the ascending minor scale and descending minor scale is harmonized. Same thing for major. His idea was if you practice this in every key, you'll know how to realize any bass. In fact, even if the composer forgets to put in the figures, you'll be able to tell because you'll have sort of in your ear and in your fingers which harmony belongs with each note in the bass. And if you become an expert in doing this, then you can compose or improvise no problem. Now, since this is so small, let's zoom in on just one of these scales. At the time Campion published his treatise on the rule of the octave, Roman numerals were not yet in use to think about harmony. Instead, musicians really thought mainly in terms of figured bass, like you see on the screen and like we've used at times in this course. We could apply some Roman numeral thinking here. For instance, consider the first three harmonies. That would be 1, 5, 4, 3, 1, 6. So that's the very same passing chord progression we studied earlier in this video. Same with the final three harmonies. They would be 1, 6, 5, 4, 3, 1. In fact, this rule of the octave tradition is probably part of the reason why composers tend to use 5, 4, 3 when passing from 1 to 1, 6, instead of 5, 6, 4 triads, as we saw earlier. Campion was in fact very proud of his achievement in popularizing the rule of the octave. He's so proud, in fact, that he even wrote a song about it. That's right, this is actually a song by Campion about how famous he is for having brought the rule of the octave to light, having popularized this as a way of thinking about harmony, improvisation, and composition. Notice the way it's written. It's written in bass clef with some figures. If you look at the opening, you see some sevens above some of the bass notes. So this is a bass line that you can play, realize as figured bass, and sing. Notice also the passages with the 16th notes. We have an octave scale up and down in C major, a few lines down, an octave scale up and down in D minor. Why? Because to learn the rule of the octave, you have to play it in major and minor. Why is that? Because as Campion explains, this rule of the octave is so great, it goes up to heaven and then descends down to the cellar. Je m'appelle Campion.
Je m'appelle Campion, disciple d'Apollon, philosophe joyeux et grave, qui mit au jour la règle de l'Octave. Je m'appelle Campion, disciple d'Apollon, philosophe joyeux et grave, qui mit au jour la règle de Amant, si vous allez jusqu'à ce nombre-là, peut-être pour un mot vous dire assez au-là. Et vous, cœur, chantez la règle de l'octave qui monte jusqu'au ciel et descend à la barbe. Amant, si vous allez jusqu'à ce nombre-là, peut-être pourra-t-on vous dire assez au-là. Et vous, du cœur, chantez la règle de l'octave qui monte jusqu'au ciel et descend à la barbe.
J.S. Bach didn't compose a song about the rule of the octave that I know of, or a song about his exploits as a teacher of harmony, but he did compose the Prelude in C major from Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1 that you heard at the very beginning of this video. The image on the screen is a manuscript of a draft version of that prelude as it appears in a booklet called The Little Notebook for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. It was a collection of teaching pieces that Bach used with his students, including with his son Wilhelm Friedemann. You can take a look at the notation. The left hand is written in bass clef. The right hand is written in soprano clef, which we don't use so much today, but historically was used a lot. Soprano clef means the bottom line is a C. So the first measure in the right hand, you can see it's C, E, G, C, makes up a C major arpeggio. A curious thing about what you see here is the first several measures have every note written out, but at a certain point, the writing switches to just writing out block chords. The idea being that if someone were playing from this, they would learn the pattern, the figuration, the texture, the arpeggio pattern from the first several bars, and then could apply that on top of the chordal framework, which is like a shorthand for the rest of the piece. But where did those chords come from? How did the composer conceive of the harmonies from one measure to the next in developing this prelude? What we have here is a kind of an analysis in the form of a baseline reduction, or like a bird's eye view of the prelude. In other words, every measure, every bass note from every measure is represented here with figures underneath showing the chord that comes above that bass note. We'll listen to the prelude once more and we can get a sense for how this bass line is really the skeleton or the framework on which the prelude is organized. But I want to point out just one thing about it. The main shape of this bass line is a descending scale. We start with C, C, B, C. That's a neighboring progression around a tonic pedal. And then we basically have a scale, C, B, A, D, G. Mostly a scale. G, F, E, D, G, C. Now we're halfway through the prelude. That whole opening section of the prelude, about half of the piece, is built over a descending scale. So you get the sense that Bach could well have learned the rule of the octave or patterns similar to it, could have taught them to his students, and could have used them as a framework for developing his prelude. This image on the screen comes from an analysis by Joel Lester. You could look up the article if you'd like to learn more about other preludes by Bach that are organized this way. Lester wasn't the first music theorist to discover this aspect of the piece, but he did write a very nice article about it. Let's listen to the prelude, and I want to encourage you to sing along, or at least hum along, with the bass line. Let's see if we can trace that bass line. I'll try to use some animation to help you orient yourself as we go. Get a sense for that descending scale as the backbone to this piece.
We focused a lot in this course about how bass lines give a clue to the directions phrases are going in terms of harmony. I think we can see that in the big picture in the bass line from this prelude. Namely, the opening, basically the first half of the piece, starts with a tonic pedal and then a tonic scale, a scale that goes from C down an octave to C. That all represents a kind of expansion of tonic. What follows are some harmonies that emphasize scale degree 4, F, scale degree sharp 4, F sharp, scale degree flat 6, A flat. We know that scale degree 4 or 6 in the bass tends to represent the subdominant function. Then we arrive at a long section of the piece with a dominant pedal. That is a dominant expansion. Arriving finally at a tonic pedal that wraps the piece up. In other words, we could hear this entire prelude as a sort of tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic. In fact, J.S. Bach didn't write not only a song, he also didn't write a book about how to compose preludes, but his son C.P.E. Bach did, and he suggested that using the rule of the octave will be a great way to open a prelude, and a dominant pedal followed by a tonic pedal will be a great way to end one. These are techniques he learned from his father and from his father's music, and that we can recover through our analysis of the prelude as well. So let's summarize what we've learned. We can classify the ways composers use 6/4 chords, at least within the classical tonal tradition, into 4 types. These types can be identified based on the bass motion, the metrical placement, and the context within a phrase. Cadential, passing, and pedal 6/4 chords, these are all embellishing chords. They are never the main harmonies. Whereas arpeggio 6/4 chords are consonant chords. They are the main harmony. What I mean by that is when I have an arpeggio 6/4 chord, G, C, E, that really does express C major as a main harmony. Whereas if I have a cadential 6/4 chord with the same notes, G, C, E, in that case, that's a G major harmony. The C and the E are dissonant notes, non-chord tones, embellishments that have to resolve down by step to clarify and affirm the main harmony G, B, D. That's the difference between 6/4 chords as embellishments versus 6/4 chords as consonant main harmonies. And as you'll find, I think from the examples we've seen today, and if you continue with your work and analysis, composers in the 18th and early 19th centuries, in the Baroque, classical, and early 19th century styles, use arpeggio 6/4 chords somewhat rarely, somewhat narrowly, whereas later in the 19th century and beyond, composers begin to use consonant 6/4 chords more freely. I hope you've enjoyed this series of 12 videos. It's been unfortunate we haven't been able to be together to review this material in person in the same room, but I've enjoyed exploring this material together with you, and I wish you the best for the rest of the course.